Despite the apparent threat, Cortes bravely traversed this narrow path, only to discover, upon entering, that the city streets were obstructed with poles and ready-to-fight residents. The Native Americans were pushed back yet again, but the battle was far from over. They regrouped once more in the city's marketplace, putting up another tough fight before being overwhelmed. They then bolted to the neighboring forest. Tabasco was seized, signifying the end of the battle. Instead of going after the Native Americans, Cortes claimed the city for the Spanish monarchy. He made 3 cuts into a large tree with his sword, proclaiming that he was there on behalf of and to support the Catholic king, vowing to defend the city with weapon and armament against anyone who dared challenge it. His soldiers echoed his statement, recording and formalizing the proceedings. The loot gathered by the Spaniards was disappointing, as most of the valuables were whisked away by the Native Americans, leaving behind merely some food supplies, which proved to be useful for the weary and famished Spaniards. At night, Cortes allocated his forces, split into 3 groups, within temples scattered in various locations, and positioned guards to defend against a nocturnal assault. He routinely checked on them at various times to confirm they were diligently on duty. At dawn, he combed the nearby woods, but he discovered no presence of any Indians, causing him slight suspicion. He dispatched undercover agents to the neighboring area, whose alarming reports indicated a large number of Indians, at least 40,000, were gathered, which agents observed from a distance as they prepared for an imminent attack. News like this could understandably shake someone in Cortes's circumstances. He faced a troop at least 100 times larger than his own, compelled to battle for their homeland, their temples, and their very lives. He recognized the danger, but, paramount in control of himself and his feelings, he kept as cool and composed a demeanor as though the report was nothing but a jest. His example infused his men with similar fearlessness, and they readied themselves to follow his lead. Cortes arranged his small army in a battle line at the base of a hill. This offered his troops protection from behind, while also affording him the chance to utilize his artillery in the most unrestricted and effective way. He stationed himself and his cavalry in a nearby copse, where they could surprise the opposition with a sudden charge when the time was right. In this formation, they calmly waited for the onset of the Indians. The particularly noteworthy day the battle took place was the 25th of March, 1519, Annunciation Day. The Native Americans appeared, mostly armed with bows and arrows. The bowstrings were made from animal tendons or strands from a deer's hair, and the arrowheads were made from sharp bones. In addition to these, they also carried throwing spears that could double as hand weapons. One of their most formidable weapons was a type of large sword made from very hard wood, the cutting edge of which was a series of extremely sharp stones arranged in array. It was so heavy that it had to be handled with both hands, like an axe. Some had clubs, others slings, that could launch large stones with remarkable force and precision. Only the leaders protected themselves with quilted woolen coverings and wooden or tortoise-shell shields. The others were unclothed, but to instill fear, they painted their faces and bodies in various colors. To appear taller, they wore headpieces with high feathers. Their war cries and music were just as intimidating as their appearance. They used reed flutes and large seashells as wind instruments, and drums made from hollowed-out tree trunks. The concept of fighting in tight formations was unknown to them. However, they did maintain a level of organization, dividing their forces into smaller units, each with its own leader. Their strategy was similar to Europe's battle tactics in that they did not engage their entire force in battle all at once. A reserve was kept to support the frontliners when the need arose. Their initial attack was always carried out with terrifying screams and with immense force, but if the enemy withstood the first wave and managed to throw the advance into chaos, panic set in and a total retreat would follow. The sight before the small battalion of Spaniards was of their adversaries advancing in innumerable quantities. Unwavering and resolute as a defense barrier, they prepared for the onslaught. Once within the range of their bows, the engagement began with chilling screams and a deluge of arrows, filling the sky. In retaliation, the Spaniards fired their cannons and muskets, littering the battlefield with numerous casualties. Still, the indigenous people were fearless. They filled the gaps left by their fallen, tossing sand into the air to mask their losses under a dust cloud. After launching another round of arrows, they engaged in close combat. The Spaniards fought valiantly against the overwhelming numbers, but the ferocity and sheer volume of their enemy meant they couldn't hold them off for long. Their lines were already breached in several areas, and a general slaughter seemed imminent when Cortes unexpectedly appeared with his cavalry, plunging right into the enemy lines. This was a horrifying and novel sight for the native people, who had never seen horsemen before. They mistook them for daunting creatures, part human and part beast, which struck such fear in them that they dropped their weapons. The Spaniards quickly seized this chance to regroup. The cannon attacks were recommenced, and with attacks from all sides, the terrified native people ran for their lives. Pleased with the proof of his superior strength, Cortes immediately ordered for the fleeing individuals to be spared, capturing only a few to facilitate a peaceful resolution with their entire tribe. 800 native people lay lifeless on the battlefield, with just 2 Spanish casualties, although 70 of them were injured. All the natives who hadn't suffered severe injuries fled. The battlefield was soon transformed into a city, named Santa Maria de la Victoria, in memory of the day and event. It later became the capital of the country. On the next day, a few of the captives were brought to Cortes. Their faces were filled with stress and dread, assuming that a death sentence was imminent, but they were taken aback and delighted when Cortes greeted them warmly, and Aguilar, the translator, announced their release. Their happiness grew when Cortes revealed his generosity by presenting them with small gifts, aimed to gain their favor. Overwhelmed with joy, they quickly relayed to their people how they had been treated exceptionally well. The impact was that the Spaniards managed to win over those hearts that were once driven by anger and revenge. To demonstrate their trust and good intentions, several Native Americans soon arrived, bringing an assortment of provisions for which they were generously rewarded. The tribal chief himself sent messengers with gifts and pleaded for peace. The request was approved, and when he visited personally shortly after, promises of peace between both parties were affirmed by exchanges of gifts. Among other gestures of friendliness, the chief brought 20 young women who knew how to bake cornbread and gifted them to Cortes. One of them, newly christened Marina, was a tribal chief's daughter who had been abducted as a child and sold to the Tabasco chief. She was not only extraordinarily attractive, but also intelligent, and quickly picked up the Spanish language, proving extremely useful to Cortes in his subsequent interactions with the Mexicans. When the tribal chief and his elites were with Cortes, they happened to hear Spanish horses neigh. Terrified, the Native Americans asked anxiously what was wrong with these terrifying creatures, referring to the horses. They were informed that the horses were angry because the chief and his tribe had not been punished more severely for their boldness in attacking the Christians. As soon as they heard this, they scrambled to bring a variety of game in an attempt to appease the horses. They humbly asked for forgiveness and vowed they would loyally obey the Christians from here on. Their self-assuredness was quickly evident. They traded Spanish trinkets for the raw materials of the region, such as food of various kinds, woolen products, and gold accessories. When asked where the precious metal originated, the locals pointed towards the west, saying, "Culhua, Mexico." The decision to abandon the region and head to the Golden Land was immediately made. Before they departed, Cortes showed his concern for their religious transformation. He emphasized Christianity's major principles, encouraging them to cast away their pagan rituals. Since the locals showed minimal resistance, the conversion ceremony started on Palm Sunday. The entire troop, led by a clergyman, paraded through the flowering fields in a solemn procession, encircled by thousands of locals, till they reached the main temple. The temple's altar had been stripped of the pagan deity's relic, replaced by a statue of Christ. The clergyman conducted the mass, the soldiers sang, the locals listened intently, stirring up strong emotions. Their hearts brimmed with deep respect for the seemingly divine entities controlling thunder and lightning. When the ceremony finished, the soldiers said their goodbyes to their local companions, and a few hours later, their small band was on its way to Mexico's Gold Coast. Chapter 4. Cortes arrives at San Juan de Ulloa, his talks for understanding with Montezuma, ruler of Mexico, anxiety in the army. Cortes, pleased with the fortunate resolution of a fight that could have ended in catastrophic results, and optimistic about the prospect of similar luck in his forthcoming ventures, left Tabasco. A supporting east breeze filled the billowing sails, setting the path to the west. Cortes took this journey as an opportunity to see all the locations previously explored by Grijalva. At last, he arrived at the island of San Juan de Ulloa, a spot Grijalva had visited before him, and he dropped anchor between the isle and mainland. It wasn't long before they spotted two unusually large and lengthy canoes making their way toward them from the shore. The natives aboard seemed to be of some significance and were seemingly afraid of potential threats, but Cortes welcomed them on board in a friendly disposition. They initiated a conversation, and Cortes waited for a clarification of their visit, but they spoke a language which Aguilar, his translator, didn't comprehend. They were speaking Mexican, but he had only mastered Yucatecan, a completely different language. Meanwhile, much to his contentment, Cortes noticed that the servant Marina from Tabasco was communicating with some of the Native Americans and realized that Marina, who was born in a region of Mexico and then forcibly taken into Yucatan, was fluent in both languages. Marina conversed with them in her native tongue, relaying their words to Aguilar in his Mayan language, who then translated it for Cortes into Spanish. Luckily, from this unintentional exchange, Cortes gathered that Pilpatoy, the local leader, and Teutile, general of the powerful Emperor Montezuma, had sent these natives to determine his intentions and to extend help should he need it for his journey. These natives, who were quite different from the untamed tribes of the Caribbeans, proved immediately noticeable to Cortes. Responding warmly to them, Cortes conveyed that he came in peace with messages for their leader that were significant. He bid them farewell with gifts and, without waiting for a response, started offloading his troops, horses, artillery, and military equipment. The welcoming locals complied, rushed to lend their support to these future oppressors, and built simple shelters for them. Poor people. If some benevolent entity had forewarned them about what was to come, revealing how dearly they would pay for their kind gesture, they would have surely recoiled from these wolves in sheep's clothing. They would have harnessed all their might and willingly spilled every last drop of their blood to expel these hazardous intruders from their homeland. The following day saw Pilpatoy and Tutil present in person, accompanied by a large squad of armed Mexicans. Their presentation was impressive, in line with the grandeur of their supreme ruler. Aware of the power dynamics, Cortes too showcased as much grandiosity as his situation allowed, aiming to highlight his significancy and that of the monarch he stood for. He commanded his soldiers to walk beside him, following military protocol and maintaining a respectful quiet. He welcomed the Mexican officials with an exhibition of dignity, which left a profound impact on them. When questioned about his orders, he responded tersely and haughtily that he was sent by Charles of Austria, the mighty monarch of the East, who had entrusted him with a message for Emperor Montezuma, meant to be personally delivered. Thus, he requested an escort to Montezuma. Ferdinand, the devout, who governed over Spain during Columbus's era, had no male offspring, but had a daughter, Joanna. She married Philip, an Austrian prince. They had a son, Charles, referred to above. When Ferdinand passed away, Charles, whose father was deceased, inherited his crown. He also ruled over the Netherlands, a territory he had gained ownership of the previous year. In due course, he was elected the German emperor, and hence became one of the influential kings in Europe. As he was the fifth in line named Charles to take over the throne, he was named Charles V. The Mexicans were really unnerved by Cortes's firm stance. They were fully aware that his insistence on meeting their emperor face-to-face wouldn't sit well with Montezuma. The emperor had been notably rattled when Europeans first showed up on Mexican shores. In Mexico, there was an old belief about a powerful civilization residing in the east, who at some point would wage war and topple the Mexican Empire. The origin of this belief isn't clear, but it's undeniable that the superstitious Mexicans, including Montezuma himself, were spooked by this old forecast as soon as the Europeans showed up. This was precisely why Montezuma's diplomats were also deeply troubled when Cortes called for the meeting. However, prior to responding to his request, they tried to butter him up with presents, like 10 bundles of high-quality wool, magnificently decorated feather shawls, so colourful they could rival the most magnificent artwork, and a basket woven from willow, stuffed with golden decor. Cortes expressed his thanks for the souvenirs, which gave them the courage to inform him that such a meeting would be out of the question. Their jaws dropped when Cortes, his face marked by a menacing and discontented look, cut them off to assert that he couldn't go back to his supreme leader, whom he was representing, without accomplishing his mission. This was more than they had bargained for, and they were left no choice but to ask Cortes to wait while they informed Montezuma of his intent and awaited his response. Cortes agreed to this and sent presents back to the emperor. The gifts included an elaborately decorated armchair, a helmet featuring a gold plaque depicting St. George slaying the dragon, a bunch of necklaces and bracelets, and cut glass trinkets, which, in a country without glass, were treasured by the Mexicans as valued gemstones. On this occasion, a number of artists from the Mexican entourage sketched out the most notable European items they came across on white cotton. Discovering these sketches were set to be delivered to their emperor, Cortes resolved to provide more engaging material, more likely to leave an impact on Montezuma. He arrayed his entire army in combat formation and exhibited a war enactment, European style, to the bewildered Mexicans. The onlookers were so incredibly overwhelmed by surprise and reverence that some took to their heels, some in a stupor collapsed to the ground, while others thought what they were witnessing was a playful diversion. Now, given the chance, the artists could render the terrifying and destructive power of European warfare. They labored with shaky hands, and upon completion of their artist depictions, these were dispatched with other gifts via fast runners to the emperor. In that region, swift runners were stationed on all major roads linking the remotest provinces to the capital, ready at a moment's notice to relay news about unfolding events in any location. In a matter of days came the emperor's response. Predictably, the request for an audience was turned down, but to soften the sting of the rejection, Montezuma coupled it with truly royal gifts. The awkward task of bringing both forward fell on Pilpatoe and Tutil. Sensibly, they first brought out the gifts in the hopes that it might prime Cortes for a more accepting reception of the response. The gifts were carried in by 100 Native Americans and laid out on mats at Cortes' feet. The Spaniards gazed avariciously at these tangible displays of the empire's wealth. There were samples of cotton that mirrored silk in its sheen and fineness, images of animals, trees, and other natural products expertly crafted in multicolored feathers, and extravagant necklaces, bracelets, rings, and additional gold ornaments. But as the sun outshines all other stars in the sky, so were these items overshadowed by 2 large circular pieces, one of which was made of solid gold, the other of silver. The gold piece depicted the sun, the silver, the moon. As if to further fuel the Spaniards' greed, several boxes filled with precious stones, pearls, and gold nuggets from the rivers and mines were offered. Cortes received these generous presents with an air of deep respect for the donor, and from there, the ambassadors went on to the more challenging part of their directive. They made clear on behalf of their leader that he couldn't allow foreign troops to near the city or continue to stay within the bounds of Mexican territory. They were asked to immediately leave. As sensible and fair as the ask was, Cortes reacted like someone who'd been disrespected, and argued even more arrogantly than before. He unequivocally refused to accept the response, stating that both his and his leader's honor would be tarnished should he retreat without a meeting. The Mexicans, who were used to unquestioning obedience to their leader, stared in disbelief at a man who had the audacity to negate their ruler's orders. This nerve was so shocking to them, they had trouble regaining their composure. Finally, they collected themselves and pleaded with this brash European for another delay to report back to the capital regarding his unanticipated intransigence. Cortes agreed once more, but with the stipulation that he wouldn't have to wait too long for a response. As firm and resolute as he seemed in these negotiations, he wasn't fully confident that his position was solid. He had the intuition that he was dealing with a formidable, well-organized government. It seemed like an incredibly risky move to go against such a powerful entity with a small group of Spanish opportunists. Even so, he remained staunch in his audacious plan to undertake the mission, regardless of the cost. Two factors motivated him. The first was religious fervor. He was convinced he would be serving a divine cause if he could convert the pagans to Christianity. The second was rooted in his own precarious situation. After the incident with Velázquez, the governor, upon leaving Cuba, he surely couldn't expect to avoid repercussions upon his return. Since he was in peril anyway, he figured he might as well gamble on an unprecedented expedition rather than face the threat of execution on his return. Regrettably, several of his soldiers were becoming increasingly uneasy, particularly those with stronger ties to Velázquez than to him. They exerted considerable effort to instigate dissent among the ranks and incite a rebellion in an attempt to coerce their leader into returning to Cuba. But the allure of uncovering immense, unending riches was so compelling that nothing else made a significant impact on them. Besides, they had reasons to anticipate a promising response from Mexico soon. Eventually, a response arrived. However, it was nothing like they had expected. Rather than being troubled by the firm refusal of the Spanish general, Montezuma had bravely resolved to stick to his choice that the Europeans should leave. Tutil delivered the uncomfortable news, as well as additional sizable gifts. Cortes decided it'd be better this time to adopt a less arrogant stance, and gently responded that the Christians deemed it their duty to enlighten their uninformed neighbors about the tenets of their faith, which guided every person towards the only path of fulfillment. This was why his superior king had dispatched him to expose Montezuma and his people to the wrongness of their ways, which they could no longer observe without feeling sympathy. Hence, he couldn't depart without further pressing for this interaction to occur. Tutil could barely restrain his irritation long enough for Cortes' words to come to an end. Eventually, he stood up in rage and adamantly asserted that since the emperor's kind proposals were ineffective, his leader's directives would be executed in a more persuasive style. With that, he hurriedly stormed out, with the whole of his entourage and all the Mexicans present in the area following him. Shortly after, the entire area was vacated by the locals. This was beyond what Cortes had anticipated. The situation caught him off guard, and as a result, his predicament gravely escalated. With much unease, he pondered on the consequences that would inevitably follow this turn of events. The most pressing crisis facing them was the total absence of food and supplies, which the welcoming locals had up until now generously provided. Those within the troop who were disgruntled began to step up their attempts to pressurize Cortes into returning to Cuba. They now had no qualms about openly criticizing him, attributing his actions to recklessness, and were urging their peers not to allow him to guide them any further down the path to destruction. Cortes, equally brave and strategic, rallied on his aides to discreetly gauge the troops' sentiment, and upon realizing that the rebels weren't influencing the troops significantly, he called upon the key instigators, with one individual named Ordaz standing out, approached them in a non-confrontational manner, and sought clarification for their actions. They made no effort to hide their intentions, and fervently argued for embarking and returning to Cuba. Cortes calmly absorbed their words, then responded that, Given the risks they were facing, he didn't see it fit to defy their demands as their leader. Consequently, he would comply. He then had an announcement circulated throughout the camp, stating that everyone should prepare for the journey back to Cuba. He fully anticipated the commotion this would cause, and his expectations were immediately met. The Spaniards, who since their arrival had dreams filled with endless riches, appeared shocked upon discovering that their optimism was based on such weak prospects, and that without reaping any rewards for their past trials, they were to return home worse off than when they set off. These thoughts were unbearable, and a wave of disgruntled murmurs about the inconsistency of their leader spread across the camp. Cortes was thrilled at this, as he recognized that it would benefit his objectives. He schemed with his trusted allies to further fuel the outrage of his troops. Their grievances ramped up, blaming outright cowardice for impeding their path to glory and fortune. This led to a surge in tension and a widespread demand for their leader to present himself. This was precisely what Cortes aimed for. He appeared immediately, wearing an expression of utmost surprise. They collectively accused him of lacking bravery for doubting the success of a mission aimed at spreading the true faith and promoting their homeland's glory and benefits. They also asserted that they were resolute in continuing the noble path they had embarked on, and would choose a replacement leader if he abandoned them out of fear. Their defiant declarations delighted him, and he took a while to recover from his astonishment. Finally, he began to voice his amazement at their accusations. He assured them that it had never been his intention to abandon hopes as immense as they were justified. However, upon hearing that his entire army had lost hope and desired to retreat, he had reluctantly agreed to yield to their wishes. At this point, his riled-up soldiers unanimously claimed he had been misled. A minority had falsely accused the entire army of cowardice. They were prepared to risk their lives and shed their blood to fulfill his grand plan. He could lead them wherever he wished. They were committed to following him, even to their death. Everything was unfolding as Cortes hoped. He praised, with a joyful and content demeanor, the unwavering loyalty of his troops and affirmed to fulfill the collective wishes they had so clearly expressed. Therefore, he concluded, he would conclude his stint in the current region and lead a majority of the army deep into the country. His decision was met with universal applause. Then came the final move in his carefully planned strategy. Even though he was their chosen leader, his total power was solely based on their support. The complete control of his soldiers, who had initially launched him into command, under changing circumstances, could snatch away his leadership. He attempted to preclude this possibility by assigning trusted allies to a court of justice for the new colony. Barely had this happened, and barely had the justices convened when Cortes approached them, carrying his commander's baton. Upon obtaining their approval, he addressed them. "From this point on, gentlemen, I see you as the delegates of our mighty monarch. Your rulings will forever carry the integrity of law. It's obvious that our military needs a leader whose command doesn't rest on the whims of his troops. Currently, that's my position. Given that the governor has cancelled my appointment, both my authority and my status are questionable. I feel obliged, therefore, to let go of my leadership, whose foundation is so shaky, and entrust it into your hands, asking you in turn, after careful deliberation, to appoint in the name of our king a person you deem most suitable for command. As for myself, I'm prepared as a regular infantryman, with spear in hand, to set an example of compliance to whoever is chosen as the leader." After saying this, he kissed his command baton, respectfully passed it to the Chief Justice, set his resignation letter on the table, and exited. Immediately after, the judges proceeded with the charade. To maintain a facade, they accepted the resignation, went through the motions of deliberation, eventually selected a new leader, and Cortes was chosen for the position with one voice. Following this, the military was called in, and the selection was announced and warmly received. Chapter 5. Establishment of the city of Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz. Disgruntled tribal chiefs, align with Cortes. Demolition of a pagan temple, due to human sacrifices. Spread of Christianity. Cortes scuttles his fleet, after dispatching a ship to Spain. Cortes had become the officially sanctioned leader of 600 ravenous predators, facing the innumerable Mexican masses who were as vulnerable as lambs without a shepherd. The Supreme Court, handpicked by Cortes, named the newly formed settlement prior to his leave as the wealthy city of the authentic cross, or Villarica de la Vera Cruz. The prospective city was branded wealthy because this was the site where they got their first glimpse of the Mexican Empire's riches via the initial gifts they received, and optimistically, where they believed the wealth of the rather unlucky locals would gradually pour in. The suffix authentic cross was included since they arrived on the anniversary of the crucifixion. This exceptional name for the inaugural European colony in Mexico signifies two vital driving forces behind the Spanish explorers, the lust for wealth and religious fervor. They were equally driven by the desires to line their pockets with gold and populate heaven with souls. Such a blend of earthly and divine, coupled with brutality masked as benevolence, epitomized their unashamed greed and feigned holiness. The unhappy Velázquez group in Cortes' crew soon identified they had been tricked and restarted their complaints. Cortes promptly grabbed those who were the most outspoken and had them restrained aboard the ships. Those who were innocently swayed into siding with the rebels were assigned, under a dependable head and assisted by several steadfast allies, to the nearby region to gather provisions. After they returned with ample supplies and hunger was relieved, a resolution was swiftly reached. Every one of them recognized his power, and promptly became his most dedicated and loyal followers. Their fate and his were now bound, as they had collectively taken this critical path and must follow him wherever he guided. When tranquility was completely re-established, the Spaniards finished their preparations for departure, and a lucky incident removed all hindrances. They encountered 5 Native Americans, emissaries from a tribe leader whose territory was close by, who requested to be taken to the Spanish leader. Their wish was granted, and Cortes, with the assistance of his translator, received the pleasing information that the tribal chief of Zempoala was aware of the significant achievements the Spaniards had made at Tabasco and was eager to create a friendly pact with them.